As always, recordings of our virtual meetups will be available on YouTube about a week after the meetup, and we'll post a message on our meetup page when the recording is ready. Next, I am very pleased to introduce our speaker today, Victor Wu. Victor Wu is the CEO and co-founder of Ensemble. Ensemble helps companies make decisions faster by improving their communications cultures in the remote work and hybrid work pandemic age. Previously, Victor was head of product at Tilt, a Kubernetes dev tools company. He previously also worked at GitLab and Grubhub. Today, our questions will be handled just in the middle of the talk. So if you have a question, feel free to unmute yourself or put them in the chat and I'll ask them to Victor. Take it away, Victor.
Great. Yeah, so we don't have a lot of people here. So is that one person Suj, or do you want to introduce yourself? Might as well, since we don't have a lot of people here. Oh, and they left.
No, they ran away.
So I'm happy to just go through the ideas, especially if this is recorded. Is that a good idea?
Yeah, we do get views on our YouTube page as well.
Okay. So yeah, I wanted to make this make sure this is useful for everybody. So if this is just a recording, that's also great. So for people who are now watching on YouTube, yeah, so I'm going to give a little bit of background on remote work. We're all doing remote work right now. Chances are, if you're watching this video, you might be watching it again after it was posted on the channel. You got a notification, so you might actually be watching it during the day. You might be watching it on your phone. It's a whole new world where a lot of information consumption is being done asynchronously, and so that's going to be a big topic today in what I want to chat about. And in particular, I wanted to talk about how we work day to day. So unfortunately, during this pandemic, I think a lot of people have been just inundated with a lot of Zoom meetings, and perhaps that's why you didn't want to join this one, just watching it on YouTube, because it is so laborious, and you're going to the office. So if you're watching this video, probably you're in the PyData community, you're probably some type of technical person, or you work with technical folks, or in your day-to-day job, you're coming to work. But despite, maybe before the pandemic, you were doing a lot of work by yourself or with your team in the office, but now you're spending a lot of the days on Zoom, or maybe you're starting to get back into the office. But regardless, in my experience and working with a lot of companies, a lot of folks are just spending a lot of time in meetings. And if you're in a technical role and you're in a smaller company, that might not be the case. So congratulations, that's great for you. If you're in a larger company, you probably are in more meetings. But if you're in a larger company, but you're in, say, a smaller team, or there's a business sponsor or somebody on your team that is handling a lot of those meetings, and you just get a list of tasks to do, that's also great. But today I wanted to focus on what knowledge workers do. And so when I say knowledge workers, I don't mean just tech workers like yourself. I mean essentially everybody that fortunately during this pandemic can continue to do work. So as we know, during this pandemic, a lot of people couldn't continue to do work. Maybe they're in the restaurant industry, maybe they're in retail for whatever reason. But if you're a knowledge worker, pretty much the definition is if you were able to continue to work, then you're a knowledge worker. So that's anybody that can get their work done in front of a computer most of the time. And so if you look at the numbers, tech workers are actually a very small proportion of those folks. Knowledge workers, there's many knowledge workers in the world, but only a small percentage of them are actually doing what we call tech work, or IT, or whatever term you want to apply to that. And so what I'm going to talk about today really has broad implications on just the working staff, or the working folks in this world, frankly, going forward, especially in this world of COVID and of work from home and hybrid work. And for me, for example, I thought that we would be done this COVID silliness by now, but it's clear to me now that we're going to be here for a couple of years at a minimum, and things are going to change. So I think this will be really relevant for you watching it today, whether you're in tech, you're working in tech, whether you're, you want to do a career in middle management, where you want to do a different type of career, um, chances are you're going to be doing some type of knowledge work. So that's what I wanted to give a setting there. Additionally, I wanted to give a little bit of background on where this remote work, or what folks are doing nowadays, and what I think they will be doing going forward in terms of remote work. So for some during this past year, that might have been mean that, in March or April, especially if you're in North America, you ended up on Zoom, since March, and then maybe for a month or two you were on Zoom all day, and then soon your company said that this is ridiculous, we can't be on Zoom all day, and then you start to do different things. Maybe you use more Slack, maybe you reduce the Zoom usage, maybe you try different tools. For example, some companies tried VR, for example, which is pretty crazy. There's one company I knew that sent Oculus headsets to all their employees across the world, in like the middle of summer, and then they were trying to do that. And some folks, there's some other tools out there where, for better or worse, it's not just only Zoom, but you're literally online all day. And then so some of these tools are, you might have an avatar and you're walking around in your screen and try to mimic the office setting, so on and so forth. So maybe you're one of those companies, and you've experienced that. And so yeah, so I'm sure there's a diversity of folks who have been really experiencing different things throughout this pandemic, and I wanted to just acknowledge that, because it has been a tough year. And I also want to acknowledge folks that, I mean, there's lots of folks that just maybe just lost their job because of downsizing. I was at a company and we worked with customers. I can't necessarily name that customer, but that customer was a tech company, but they had a strong operations side of the business. So when the operations side of the business didn't need that many, because of COVID, they couldn't do that much business. That had a ripple effect on the tech ecosystem within that company, and a lot of people got laid off. So if you're one of those folks, I want to acknowledge you as well. So there's been a lot of changes, and on the flip side, there's been a lot of opportunities. A lot of tech workers now can do remote work. You hear stories of people moving to different cities. So there's been a lot of great things there. And then one group of people I did want to acknowledge last, and certainly not least, is people just with families at home and have been struggling. I worked with, during the pandemic, I had some coworker, or the company that I worked with was largely based in New York. If you remember at the beginning of the pandemic in the United States, New York was hit pretty heavily. And what's worse is that in New York, a lot of folks are just in small apartments. And so imagine you're in a small apartment, your spouse is working, your significant other is working, your kid cannot go to school, and it's just a terrible situation. So I want to acknowledge you if you were in that situation, or still in that situation. I had a coworker who literally, they were working in the middle of the night, and that's the only time they could work. And during the day, they would have to just take care of their kids. So it's been a tough year, and things, hopefully for you, if you're watching this video, you've gotten to some steady state. Maybe, like I mentioned, if you have kids, you figure out childcare. Maybe you found that job. Maybe you have a plan with your spouse, and so on and so forth. But yeah, it's a whole new world, and I wanted to acknowledge that situation now. But I also wanted to sort of tease and like scratch that itch, if you might have one, from an intellectual perspective. What is this remote work? Why are we stuck in Zoom meetings all day? So there were studies even before the meeting. If you just Google this, Google, people enjoying meetings, or well, you can just Google meetings and people thinking whether meetings are good or not. You'll see a bunch of results. There's a good number of research papers, Harvard Business Review, Gartner, those types of publications, and consulting firms. What they'll tell you is that people have always hated meetings. Meetings never made sense at all. And so you would hear statistics of up to 60–70% of folks that just said meetings are useless. They're ineffective. Why are we in meetings all day? And so one takeaway, and I'll try to sum up some of the takeaways from today. One of the takeaways from today is that the pandemic is not something that necessarily caused a lot of the pain that you're feeling within the workplace. Of course, it caused a lot of the pains that I mentioned earlier within your work situation. But think of before you were in the pandemic, think of all the times where you went to that meeting that you thought was really silly and didn't make sense. Think of the other times where you're really frustrated, where you try to deliver work to your manager or to a coworker, and they didn't read your email, they didn't read your work. And think about all those efficiencies there or inefficiencies there. Well, COVID was just shining a light on this trend. And so that's a big takeaway here, is that enterprise workplace or the enterprise work for knowledge workers has increasingly suffered from this trend of things just becoming increasingly inefficient. And what does inefficiency mean? Well, if you're CEO of a big company and you have thousands of workers, that's going to affect your bottom line. If you're an individual contributor, an IC, and you got into your field, you're a data scientist, you're a data engineer, you're a product manager, and you wanted to go to this company to make a change, but you spend 6 hours of your day in meetings or just stand-up meetings, status update meetings, and you thought you wanted to change the world, but you go to work every day and you're in 6-hour meetings and you're drained, and you have 2 hours of free time spread in 15-minute chunks. You're not even doing any work anymore, and you're feeling the pain of that, and you thought you could really change the world, and you can't. Well, that's horrible, and I feel sorry for you, but that shouldn't be the case. And so COVID has shined a light on these things, and I'm glad to say that many companies, especially smaller companies, have recognized this and taken this advantage of the COVID world to realign their business. A lot of businesses are starting up. I started a business right in the middle of the pandemic earlier this year, and we're just specifically addressing this problem. But many companies in this world are able to start from scratch, but many larger companies are not. And so we're going to see this shift over time. But suffice it to say, again, the takeaway is that COVID is not introducing problems. It's just making problems that were always there really obvious to people. And that has all these knock-on effects. One of them is that, if you're doing remote work and you can get a job at a new awesome startup, then you don't have to put up with all this politics and 6 hours of meetings every day. And that's great. And so we're seeing some of that right now. But at the same time, I wanted to again emphasize that COVID is not introducing problems. It is shining light on existing problems, on these existing trends. And if you want to look at the history, so I'm now going to talk a little bit about the history. Is there's all these confluence of trends. One of the trends is, I mentioned knowledge work, right? So if you think about, I'm not going to go all the way back, really back in history. You can think of what is the history of work, and you can think of Egyptians building the pyramids. That's work, right? But fast forward a lot to think about factories, right? Like post industrial revolution, you had factories, and then you had factories, and what that meant is, because of the industrial revolution, people went to work, had a concept of going to work. Before the industrial revolution, you didn't really have that concept. Maybe you were doing apprenticeship, maybe you were on a farm. So work is not really work. It's sort of work is blended with your life, which is really funny because a lot of people nowadays talk about work-life balance. Back then it was already work-life balance. Well, there was not much balance, but there was definitely no separation of work and life. It was because of the Industrial Revolution, people are in factories. Now there was this concept of like a 9 to 5, or I'm sure it was longer hours than that. But then there was a separation between work and life. Post-World War II, you had a lot of industry and construction and things like that. And then you had this rise of knowledge work. And so the reason why we have 9 to 5 in knowledge work, again, if you think about that, why do we need a 9 to 5, especially if we're doing a lot of the things that I'm going to talk about today? You actually don't need a 9 to 5. And in fact, again, these newer companies are not doing the 9 to 5. The 9 to 5 is actually a legacy of factory work because of hours. If you're working in the modern day Amazon factory, you're working these shifts. Or if you're a doctor, or if you're retail, or you're in doing these industries where you have to have this real-time nature, then there's this concept of shift. But knowledge work doesn't need shifts at the end of the day. But because work evolved from shift work, that's why knowledge work is in shifts. So that's another thing to take away from a historical perspective, where knowledge work is only going to be more and more dominant in this world. Is going to be led by a digital revolution, right? Because you've heard things like Mark Andreessen of VC say software is eating the world. So this is PyData Chicago, Mark Andreessen, one of the early people that made Mozilla, Firefox, and graduated from Urbana-Champaign, a couple hours south of Chicago. So he said, like, software is eating the world. So there's this trend of digitization software that's knowledge work. And so all companies are becoming software companies. So not that everybody's going to become a programmer, but there is more and more programming and software jobs, and then there's more knowledge work surrounding those jobs. So consequently, more jobs are going to become knowledge jobs. And then there's also other trends, obviously automation. And so in this community, you all know about ML and AI and all those things in automation. So that's another reason why a lot more jobs are going to become, well, there's going to be less automated jobs. So the proportion, at least, and if some people say, like, oh, all these jobs are going away. So hopefully a lot of these jobs will be replaced by knowledge worker jobs. So we see a big trend toward knowledge work. And then so then it really comes down to, why does knowledge work need to be even in shift? Does that even make sense? So that actually does not make sense. And so now the question is then, well, what is the right model for knowledge work? If we see this problem with too many meetings, so essentially too much synchronicity, we see the problem of shift work, which knowledge work doesn't really need shift work. You don't really, if most of your day is writing a code as a programmer, running a model as a data scientist, or if you're a manager, even you're doing a lot of organization, you're meeting with folks. So if you can reduce those meeting times, then essentially you don't actually really need a lot of this synchronicity. You can actually get a lot done asynchronously. So how can you do that? Well, there's actually a great model for this. That's something that a lot of folks don't realize, that we've actually been doing a lot of asynchronous work. And so if you're watching this video, you probably have some technical background. You're probably already doing a lot of this work that you don't even know. And so the example is, I don't think we're going to be able to, I don't think on the YouTube here, you're going to be able to see, I was going to paste some things in the chat, but what I'll do is actually just share my screen really quickly here. And so I'll give you a glance at some of the tools or history really quickly here on my notepad here, or what is this, Atom. And so I wanted to highlight, so these are a bunch of links, so Wikipedia links, but you can ignore all the URLs here, but I wanted to highlight a lot of these open source tools. So there's a lot of links here, different companies and tools, but I wanted to highlight a couple of things. One of them is, again, we don't have to go to the beginning of like history and computing. We don't have to go to Turing or anything like that. We can just jump all the way to the 60s and 70s, where computing was starting to become popular. And again, you're in this community, so academia, at least in the United States, was one of the first places where computing was popularized. In particular, email was, of course, popularized in a couple of campuses in the United States. They were sending research papers across like ARPANET and whatever those early networks were. And then along the way, you had a lot of these early tools. So some of these were Unix, Emacs, VI, GCC, the C library, Perl, Linux, and Python came in 1991, relatively late. And so why I've highlighted these tools in particular, if you squint your eyes, you'll notice that these tools are all open source tools. So what's really interesting is that you see this really interesting confluence in these early days of computing, which is that in the early days of at least software collaboration, mostly in the United States, you had folks in academia, and then in these meetup groups. A lot of them, they were meeting up, some were like this, but obviously they didn't have Zoom back then. But they were creating they were using the software, and they were also using the software to create the software. So what do I mean by that? Well, they were getting together, and then they were going on forums, really primitive forums. They were going inside emails. They were And what were they doing? They were trading ideas. They were doing a lot of academic research, like the physics community, computer science community. So they were doing very fundamental research in networking. And it's sort of obvious, like if you think about early adopters. So these were early adopters of these technologies. So they were interested in changing the technologies themselves. So in addition to doing some of those early, hard sciences, they were actually building the computer science protocols themselves. So they were, inventing TCP/IP. They were building computers. They were doing the hardware, the software, the networking, the protocols. They were saying like, do we do UDP or do we do TCP? What's the better one? So do we do packet switching versus circuit switching? What makes more sense? So to us, modern, quote unquote, modern people in 2021, it's obvious, like, oh, of course it's TCP/IP, right? Of course we use UDP under these conditions and those conditions. Back then it wasn't clear. People were doing research. They were doing research in the universities. They were doing research in industry, partnering with places like Bell Labs and so on and so forth. What's really interesting, I wanted to hone in on a specific community, was the open source community. So those tools I listed: Unix, Perl, Python, C, GCC, the compiler for C, Unix, Linux. All those were open source software projects. And so I'm sure many of you are participating in open source projects because, like, even if you're not like one of those weekend open source, programming nerds, and I use that term in a very nice way, in a good way, you are nonetheless using open source software in your daily activity because your stack at work is using some open source software. So open source is not the future of the world. It is what you're using right now. And if you're in PyData, you're using Python. That is open source, right? And so when you think of open source, what do you think about? Well, you think of GitHub. Well, let me tell you, like, GitHub is the new kid on the block. GitHub is so super, super new. Open source, as I showed you earlier, was already around in the 50s and 60s. That's how people just collaborate. They didn't have the notion of open source because that's how universities and academia has always worked. There's like almost no profit motive. It's only nowadays that, like, GitHub in the past year or two, you can now sponsor like open source maintainers, which is a great thing, right? Don't get me wrong, but that was never the case, right? So open source has always been a thing. And so how did people do open source, and how did people collaborate? And as I've mentioned earlier, well, but they would get together on forums, they would trade emails, they would meet up. But one key thing that they did is that they would get together and write code asynchronously. And that's what you do today, right? So you might have a code review, right? If you're a data scientist, depending on your persuasion, and this might be controversial if you're a data scientist, like there's no like workflow for data scientists yet. This is like a wide open thing. Whereas like in software engineering, you have like Agile, and then you have like GitHub and GitLab and things like that, and like DevOps. And then machine learning, data science workflows. This is brand new. So there's many software startups in this space trying to do all these tools. And this is very exciting. And you don't have that yet. But in any case, nonetheless, even though you don't have that rigid flow, I'm sure you're still doing a lot of work asynchronously. I'm sure you're still putting up, PRs in GitHub or merge requests in GitLab if you use that at work. And a lot of this is asynchronous work. You might get together over a Zoom call to do a code review, but what you're probably doing is you're writing some code, you're sending a pull request, and somebody reads it and gives you comments, and then you merge it into the mainline branch, the master branch. And it turns out that's always how people have done it, which is pretty amazing. Like nobody thought of doing it any other way. Or maybe they did, right? And they quickly figured out that it didn't work because, as a lot of you you're an engineer watching this, and you know that computers are dumb. If you miss a semicolon, then your code will break. So it has to be really crystal clear, perfect. If you collaborate on a Google Doc and you miss a period or you miss that Oxford comma, somebody is going to yell at you, but the Google Doc will still work. It will still serve its purpose. Your code will grind to a halt if it doesn't work, if you miss that semicolon. And even today, it will not work. There's a lot of ways around it. There's like all these ways to mitigate that. But at the end of the day, computers are dumb. So these early pioneers of open source collaborators, they've always done it this way. And in particular, in the early days, they didn't even have Git. So there's GitHub. Before GitHub, there's Git. And so some of you might not know that they're actually two different things. So before Git, there was things like CVS or SVN. And so these were early version control systems. So if you use an early version control system, like back in the day before Git was popularized, you might have been, you might have been cursed with using SharePoint. And what you had to do if you write a program is that you would have to check out a file, and that file was locked. And then you would write your code in that file, and you made sure your program would run. And then you would now upload your file back into SharePoint, Microsoft SharePoint, and then you would unlock it or close the lock or release the lock, that's the term. And so other people could check out that file. And so later on, other source control systems would allow you to optimistically check out the file, even though it was being checked out by other people, but then you have to resolve conflicts, and it was really horrible. So later on, Git was invented. So Linus Torvalds was inventing Linux. So if you look at the history, he started Linux in 1991 as something, as an improvement over Unix. And Linus Torvalds got really annoyed at this collaboration I talked about, with this, SharePoint and other source control systems. And he said, like, this is too ridiculous. This is too complicated. And so he invented Git, and he released that in 2005. So that's really new if you think about it. 2005. So Git was invented in 2005. Again, there's no such thing as GitHub or GitLab or Bitbucket. None of those things existed yet. So Git was the first thing that came around that Linus Torvalds shipped as a way to help him and his community continue to iterate on Linux. And so how they used that was that they were able to asynchronously work together to continue to create Linux using Git. And I'm sure a lot of you know how Git works, or why Git is special is because you get the entire repository and all changes of the repository locally on your machine. And so you can jump on an airplane and continue to code without the internet, even though modern planes do have the internet. So that's what really set things apart with Git. And so people were already doing asynchronous collaboration over Git, and they didn't have GitHub. They definitely didn't have GitLab. They didn't have Bitbucket. But what they would do is that they would send these things called Git patches. So inside the Git protocol. So if you don't know about this, Git and GitHub are totally different things. Git is a terminal. It's a terminal program, right, on your your Linux terminal, your Unix terminal, your Windows terminal. It technically does not have a web or a GUI, a graphical interface. It is all terminal-based UI, and you can even have diffs, right, in Git, right, on your terminal. You can type the diff command. You can compare changes. You can have the colors in terminals because modern terminals have colors, and that's how people would collaborate before GitHub. Or even like SourceForge, right? They would send Git patches to each other. They would review the diff, and they would merge in the main line, and they would do this all over email. And then it's actually you can do a man Git, and then you can look at one of the commands, which is like the Git patch command, I believe it's called. And so along the way, people, some enterprising folks realized that why don't we just build a web UI on top of this? Because the internet was starting to becoming a thing. The web was starting to become a thing really quickly. And so you had repositories, which were the first version of like open source innovation. So you had these things called like SourceForge. Some of you might have used in like many years ago, but SourceForge was a way to store code and actually store binary. So it wasn't very developer centric. Later on, you had projects like Google Code and then GitHub. And so they arrived pretty much at the same time, I believe. And but GitHub was the one that really shined because it was hyper focused on the developer, and they invented the pull request, which is really just a diff, right? If you think about what's the pull request, well, it is the Git diff on the terminal, and they slap a web UI on it, and then they make it collaborative in that there's a comment thread. So the analogy here is that what did Google do to Microsoft Word? Well, what did Google do? Well, they just took Microsoft Word and they allowed people to comment on it in a web UI. And so that's exactly what GitHub did. And so these technologies actually emerged at a similar time. And so that's what's really critical, is that these are asynchronous ways of collaborating. And so these early folks had a way to collaborate asynchronously again. And so they didn't have to go into a meeting. All they did was they, they just wrote some code, they wrote some comments, and that's how GitHub works, and so on and so forth. So I'm going to fast track to how now. So that was the first part, sort of just a quick overview of the history of what I would call async collaboration. And then I'll tell you now, where does this apply today and going forward? Because everything I've explained might be all good and well, but like, how does that apply to you today? Well, what I personally experienced was back in 2016. I was an early product manager at a company called GitLab, which is an open source alternative to GitHub. And nowadays it's pretty big. So a good portion of you watching this video probably know about GitLab. You might use it as a weekend project because you can install it on your own machine. But more likely, you're probably just using it in the office. Because a big proportion of these Fortune 500 companies, and if you work at a Fortune 500 company, you're probably using GitLab because the install base of GitLab is mostly in the enterprise. And so I was an early employee at GitLab, and GitLab was always remote from day one. And it was started in Europe as an open source project before it became a company. And so it had this culture of doing everything that I just mentioned, very engineer focused for in terms of the early employees, obviously a product led startup. And also for those initial customers were the developers themselves. So it made sense that the early company was doing all this asynchronous workflows. So what was interesting is that when I joined, we were still very early days as a product person, and I was starting to bridge to a connection between the technical staff and the growing business staff. So if you ever done a startup or been in a startup, 90% of the staff is doing the product, or if you're doing at least a product-led startup, a software startup, hardware startup for that matter, 90% of the staff are just engineers working on the product. As your product grows, especially if you're doing an enterprise product, your business, your sales staff, your business development staff is going to grow in proportion a lot higher. And especially if you get to obviously like a Facebook scale, a Google scale, a big proportion of your staff is doing non-technical work. So the question we had as I joined the company, we had this inflection point. Does it make sense that we continue to do this type of asynchronous work throughout the company? Can the legal team, can the biz dev team, can the marketing team, can the product team, can the design team, can all these teams, aside from software engineering, even the operations team, can they, the customer success team, can they also work asynchronously? And the answer turned out to be yes. And what's interesting is that we almost stumbled across this. I mean, some of it was luck, and some of them was we thought really hard about it. And it turns out one forcing function was remote work. And so this is how it ties into this past year. When you have remote work, when remote work is forced upon you in a blink of an eye, which is literally what happened in March of last year, your entire company scrambles, you don't know what to do. And in fact, a lot of these big companies were actually going to GitLab and saying, like, what do? We don't know how to do this. We've never done this before. So that's terrible as a forcing function because you have to react to it. And so you see people scrambling, people are going crazy. But if you're a small startup like GitLab and you've always been remote because you've been a remote startup from day one, and you're starting to grow this company and you're saying like, do we continue to do remote? And so what the story goes is that the team, they hired a small team, a sales team in San Francisco. They had an office, and within a week, the sales staff just didn't come to the office. And so like the CEO says, okay, we don't need this office. So they just closed down the office. So what happened was that we didn't need the office and people were just experimenting, and remote became a forcing function. And a forcing function, whether in technology or social science or psychology, results in two things. A forcing function, it results in like you're just oppressed and you go and result in a really negative situation, which is what a lot of companies ended up in the pandemic. Or you thrive, you innovate, you figure out some really awesome new things. And GitLab had the benefit of being really small, not being forced into remote. There's no pandemic, right? In the early, in the mid 2010s, when GitLab was growing, right? They weren't forced to do remote work. It was a choice, And so this fortuitous, this virtuous cycle allowed us to quickly innovate. And we said that this remote thing is amazing. And so what we said is like, oh, we chose remote, it's a forcing function, but what can we do to take advantage of this? It's a forcing function, but what can we take advantage? And let's not think of this as a cost to be mitigated. Let's not think of this as a business risk to be mitigated, but actually a strategic advantage for our business. So what happens in GitLab even today is meetings are a last resort. It's not the first thing that people do. Meetings are something you do if you can't do things async. So the model that GitLab did is really interesting because it's essentially the GitHub pull request model. It is a source of truth, which is the diff, and then there's a comment thread underneath, and you're commenting on the diff. So everything that happens at GitLab or should happen at GitLab is that you have a change request. So, a change request is most of the time not code if you're not an engineer, right? So a change request is like, okay, I'm doing a marketing launch next week, so I want to write this blog post. So my change request is I want to do a blog post. So we have to discuss, so I want to do a blog post. It's going to be at this time. It's going to be at this topic. So I put that out there. I mention people, and they come in and respond. And as they respond in the comment thread, we update the source of truth, similar to a GitHub pull request. You're updating that diff as people make comments. So somebody says like, oh, this is a bad variable, or you need to refactor this, and they update the diff. And then finally, they merge that code in. And so in the case of GitLab, it's what we call, we would use issues, GitLab issues, sort of like GitHub issues, to mediate this work. There would be this source of truth in the description, and then you have an asynchronous comment thread. And most of the work at GitLab gets done this way. So this is the power of asynchronicity. This is actually what a lot of companies have started doing during the pandemic last year. And so this is something that's really powerful. And the reason is that I'll go through some of these principles from or some of first principles perspective in a second, but I wanted to recall the history. This is essentially how people have been doing asynchronous work and how that ties into remote work. And why, if you sort of like peek your nose into or Google some of this, or like look in social media and think about like what are some of the newer companies in the past year have been doing this. They've been in like Google what is async work and how it relates to remote. It is a way to avoid these endless meetings, whether they're in person or on Zoom. So again, Zoom is just a manifestation of something, a problem that's always has existed. So that's why if you Google async remote work or work from home, you'll see all these results. And so some of these bigger companies that you've heard of recently in terms of shipping tools is Loom. This is this async video platform. So you can sync async videos. So in the consumer space, that's obvious. That's what is that, like Instagram videos, TikTok, right? You've always had that forever. And so classical consumerization of IT play, right? So all these consumer technologies and UIs are now being applied to the enterprise. So you have Loom, which is this async video platform. So instead of sending Slack messages, you send async video. Instead of sending async video, Loom, which was just, I think they got their like Series B or Series C. There's another company called YAC, YAC, and they started in 2019, where Loom started in 2016. So they're a little bit behind them. And they allow you to send also asynchronous video, but their bread and butter is asynchronous audio. So at GitLab and what all these companies have done, they've always been doing asynchronous text with a source of truth. And so that's been sort of like the traditional way to do things. And now people are experimenting with asynchronous video and then now asynchronous audio. And you see this trend and this change. And then there's also this other set of tools, which I very disagree with, which is that VR thing I mentioned earlier, where they want you to be at work all the time. They want you to be on Zoom all the time. And I really think that is not the future of work, because I've seen that firsthand and that does not work. But there are a lot of startups taking that view of the future of work. And I just don't think that makes sense. And I wanted to mention, what was I going to say? Yeah, so there's oh yeah, I remember what I was going to say. So GitLab, we were one of the early folks, and GitLab is the biggest company right now that is 100% remote. Obviously, the Googles and Facebooks, as their folks settle into this hybrid work from home, remote world, obviously they're going to have more staff that are remote. But think about a company that is 100% remote versus hybrid. It's super different. And we definitely don't have time today to go through that. But the only company that is 100% remote, not the only company, the company that has the most staff is GitLab. So we were inventing some really unique things there. But I do want to give credit where it's due, which is earlier companies was WordPress. So not WordPress, Automatic, the company that ships WordPress, was super, super early, but they're not at the scale of GitLab, and they're all remote. Envision, a design company or ships design tools, and Buffer, and there's a long tail of other companies that are doing this. Again, these are all smaller companies. And of course, in Chicago, Basecamp, or formerly 37 Signals, they're probably popular, unpopular for other reasons recently, but suffice it to say, they were doing remote work very early on as well. So that's a local shop that's been doing remote work. So if you look at any of the materials that these companies put out that talk about remote work, they all say the same thing: asynchronicity, and being in. And so if the folks at Basecamp, they've published a couple of books in the past. In one of their books, they say that in that company, they don't even, I've never worked there, so I don't know, but they don't have meetings. Or if you want to have a meeting with somebody, you have to like beg somebody to have a meeting. So it's like a meeting is a really sacred thing because your time is really valuable. And if you think about it, that really doesn't make sense that our modern meeting day tools is like you literally just click a button and you take an hour away from somebody's life, just like that. And if you think from like a productivity, dollars and cents perspective, that is so costly. Who are you as a product manager to say, I can take, you work at Google, like these engineers are paid like 300K a year. Think about like the ridiculous amount of money that 1 hour of their life costs. And who are you as a product manager to take that from them? So whether it's from like the bottom line of the company or just the sanity of the engineer perspective, that 1 hour is super valuable. And so it does not make sense in our modern workplace that we can just take people's time like that. And so that's why some of these companies have been doing async. And that's what my company is doing. So if you're interested in learning more of this and more of the strategies we're doing, you can always talk to me after the fact and look at my contact details. But I want to spend the remaining 5 minutes here really quickly to talk about what are those principles of asynchronous work. I've given you this history, I've given you the model of asynchronous work, but I wanted to step back and give you again a little bit more principles and benefits to really round it out, some of these takeaways, because and to give you some maybe more tangibles. And so one of them, as we talk a lot about synchronicity, another one is speed. A lot of people think async doesn't that mean that's slow? They say like, this is this common, they say that async is slow. I have to do this email and then you respond and then that takes a day to respond, that's slow. That is actually wrong, because if you have a meeting or if you tap somebody on the shoulder, and most meetings people are ill prepared, by the way, but if you tap somebody on the shoulder in the office or you Slack them, so by the way, Slack is not async, Slack is totally sync, because Slack mimics async, mimics the office synchronous place, because a Slack message is literally you just tapping on the shoulder. And how many times have you been guilty, you watching this video, of just spending an hour on Slack and scrolling through mindless emoji reactions and you're not actually doing work? So Slack is synchronous. And so when you're doing synchronous work, it's actually a lot slower because you're always in reactive mode. Somebody says, what do you think about this? And you're forced to respond in the moment. If you're doing asynchronous mode, somebody says, what do you think about this? You actually take the time to respond in a coherent manner. You actually think about it. You do the research and you respond. And so how asynchronous driven workflows and companies work is that they have multiple parallel streams of work. So when I was working at GitLab, I was literally having 20 parallel conversations easy with my engineering manager counterpart per day. He was 5 hours ahead of me in Europe. I was in East Coast United States, and we were going fast and furious. We were having like equivalent of 20 meetings per day, but not meetings because it was asynchronous conversations. And if you want to talk about speed and productivity, asynchronicity is speed and productivity. Along with speed is small iterations. This is the classic software engineering agile approach. Make small iterations, ship value to your customer, iterate. So a lot of this is tied into software. So a lot of these principles apply to like hardware and doing different types of work. But at the end of the day, if you think about it, knowledge work is about quick iterations, right? Knowledge work, if you want to be successful in today's modern business era, right? You're going to ship that, Super Bowl commercial is the counterexample, because you do that once a year, right? But you do that Twitter campaign, you see your conversions, and then your social media person tweaks the campaign and then changes something, and then now there's more conversions, and that happens literally within days or hours. So that's all about speed. So if you want to talk about speed, that's speed. And what does that mean? That means small iterations. So if you want small iterations in your knowledge work or your software, whatever, that means that's a plus for async work, because you don't need to spend hours and hours of meetings figuring out how to launch this marketing thing or ship that product. You say, I want to ship this iterative feature. I want to add this one button or change this one color or add this one tweet if I'm a marketing person. And I can do that async because it's so simple. So what happens is a lot of these asynchronous companies, every 6 weeks or before the pandemic, they would fly them. They would take all the budgets saved from not having an office, by the way, if you're an all remote company, they would spend that budget and fly people to a hotel every 6 weeks. And maybe for 3-4 days up to a week, they would brainstorm, do the high level planning, and then they would go back home, fly back home. For the next 6 weeks, they would iterate like crazy and then come back after the 6 weeks. So it could be 6 weeks, it could be 2 months, whatever, right? It doesn't really matter at the time, but the focus is, or what really matters is, if you think about it, most of your day as a knowledge worker, you're really just doing small transactional iterative things. You're not doing this huge brainstorming things day to day. So if that's the case, small iterations wins the day. And if you think about what that means, I'll give you 2 examples or manifestations of small iterations. I've been told that at Facebook, if you're an engineer, on the first day after you join the company, you make a commit to master and probably it's shipped to production. So they've set up their ecosystem, their DevOps, their engineering, so that you cannot break it. And because they want people shipping in small iterations. At Amazon, there's this thing called two-way door decisions. Don't make decisions where you can't go back on. It's a one-way door decision, means that you go one way, you cannot go back. So they rather you make really approach your business or structure your business so you're making all these two-way door decisions, so you can always quickly go backwards. So it doesn't matter if you're making small iterative decisions, you can always go back. So minimize the risk, mitigate the risk, you can move really quickly. If you must make a one-way door decision, avoid it, but prefer two-way door decisions. And so you have speed, you have asynchronicity, you have single source of truth, which I mentioned earlier, which is that description field in an issue, that diff, that Google Doc, that Notion doc, where you're all collaborating together. Single source of truth is super important, because if you're working in the office or you're working in the office before you're practicing some of these principles I've talked about, you're just doing broken telephone, which is terrible. Or there's this person, you go to this manager and they're in charge of the information. If you're doing async work, if you're doing remote work, if you're doing different time zone work, that kills your productivity, because that person goes on vacation, they're sick, they're not in the right time zone, your business grinds to a halt. And so you do not want your business based on people. You should be able to fire them. And this is actually why big companies force you to have vacations. They don't want people to have this risk. They want the business to be able to run. So that's a forcing function that big companies force you to have vacation. Single source of truth, speed, asynchronicity, transparency helps all of that. Transparency, again, helps with all of that, so you can move faster. You don't have to have you can have different time zones. Transparency leads to psychological safety as well, so that you can just come up with crazy ideas and you can move really quickly. So all of these are wrapped up together. And lastly, the most important thing, if you're doing all this asynchronous work, you need a culture of writing. And I mentioned above some of the tools that are on the market now, like with video and audio. And they're doing their best, because, if you have video or audio, then, but like, do you still want people watching your video? But it doesn't really make sense. So they're transcribing the video and the audio into text. Text is always going to be the number one thing in business. Your reading is always going to be faster to parse. You can always search text. You can index text. You can have AI. You can have all the AI in the world, but text is never going to go away in a business setting. So that's why great companies and great cultures, business, workplace cultures, async cultures, people are great writers. And so in the world of technology and code, I mentioned at the beginning of this talk, you cannot screw up because computers are dumb. And in the world of the rest of the company, and frankly, even in engineering, because a lot of your day is not just writing code, you have to communicate like whatever you're doing with the rest of the company. And a lot of that is business, right? There's so much room for error because people could say something, they don't mean something, so on and so forth. So being really good and being transactional, having a really crisp culture and being very specific transactional, that will win you the day in enterprise culture. So that's all I wanted to share today. Hopefully you found this video interesting. Yeah, I'll turn it back over to Rebecca.
Great. Thanks so much, Victor. That was a really great whirlwind history. I learned a lot. Yeah, I didn't know that Python appeared on the scene so late. Yeah, so thank you, everyone. Mostly people watching on YouTube. We have our meetups once a month, usually the last Thursday of the month. I think our next month's meetup is probably already posted on meetup.com. So stay tuned and thank you.